everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. Today I'm going to share 3 ways you can use circle stencils to create some slimline cards. I will be using some Distress Oxide inks to create each of the backgrounds for the thank you cards. I have 4 circle stencils here in a 1 inch, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch size. I will put links to these in the description below if you wish to grab a pack of these, but I'm pretty sure most of you have some form of circle stencil in your collection that you can use for each of these techniques today. This first technique is rather simple. I'm going to start by creating some 1 inch polka dots with ink, then I will layer some stamped images on top. The cards I'm creating are 3.5 by 8.5 inch cards. You might have noticed that the cardstock is a little larger than I need it. I like to build my backgrounds a little bigger than needed so that I have more area to work with. It also allows me to trim the pattern to match my card design. I have already secured my stencil to the cardstock using some magnets so that it doesn't shift, and I'm applying scattered straw ink using a blending brush. When I'm using Distress Oxide inks, I like to tap my brush off into the lid before I apply it to the stencil. These inks are a pigment dye hybrid and are a little wetter than your regular dye inks. Too much ink on your brush, it can seep under the stencil and create little blobs. When you're adding ink, use a light touch. If you brush too harshly, you could cause that stencil to shift or even create uneven patterns in the ink. You can always go back and add more ink for a deeper color. Now, these stencils are not designed for slimline cards, but I am going to be able to use them for my backgrounds. The dots over on the right match up perfectly with the line of dots on the left, and I love it when stencil designers make it easy to line up your patterns. Now, I have sped up the video here because this part of the card is easy to make. If you want, you can add more colors or blend some colors together, but I'm keeping it really simple today. Now that the stenciling is finished, I'm going to wash my stencil and bring over some stamps to create a floral background. I have brought over my stamping platform to ensure that I get complete coverage on my stamped images. I'm going to place the cardstock onto the platform and line up the stencil with the design. This platform has magnets to hold everything in place, but I like to use a little post-it tape just to make sure nothing shifts. Now that my stencil is secured, I'm going to use it like a mask to stamp these floral images. I have chosen some smaller stamps and I'm laying them down into some of the circles. I do suggest that you choose smaller images that fit in the circles for this technique so that you don't have to create any additional masks. Now that the stamps are in place, I'm going to close the door to pick up the stamps. You can see that the stamps are sticking to the stencil a little bit and trying to pick it up. That's why I secured it with tape so that it didn't shift. I'm going to use a black pigment ink pad to stamp my floral images. This ink is going to be easy to clean from the stencil and give me a nice black image in the circle. You could use dye-based ink or an archival ink, but there's a chance it will stain your stencil. After stamping the images, I'm going to clean off the stamps and then move them to other parts of the design. Now, I'm not going to fill up every circle. I'm just keeping them in groups of 3 and stamping partial images so that most of the yellow still shows through. I'm going to continue to stamp the images, clean the stamps, and reposition the stamps until I have all the images on this half complete. Then I'll move the stencil to the other half of the card. Be careful when you're moving the stencil. The pigment ink is really wet and can smear onto your project. If you are worried about ruining your background, you can wash the stencil before you reposition it. Once again, I'm securing the stencil with some repositionable tape, being really careful that I don't smear the ink onto my project. I'm going to lay out the stamps into the circles so I can add more images. Now I'm going to go off camera and continue stamping these onto the other half of the card. All right, you can see that everything has been stamped, so I'm going to clean off my stencil and show you how to assemble the first card. As you can see, I have trimmed down the stencil background to a little smaller than the Slimline base, and I've added some black cardstock for the background. I have also cut 3 thanks die cuts from black cardstock and layered them together to create a thicker sentiment. The phrase was heat embossed to make it stand out, and I've wrapped some silver thread on the left side. I'm going to place this sentiment along the bottom of the card. It's the perfect size for a slimline. Behind it, I'm going to tuck some vellum leaves and adhere them in place using some liquid adhesive. I chose to cut these out of vellum because I didn't want to add any more color to the card, but I did feel like it needed a little bit of texture. On the right side of the card, I'm going to place 3 acrylic black dots, and now the first card's complete. I love how those stamped floral elements look inside those bright yellow polka dots, and that vellum adds the perfect amount of texture. Now, this card was a simple way to use those circle stencils. Let me show you another background that uses all 4 sizes of circles. So this background is going to be a little bit more time consuming, but the results are amazing. We are going to create bubbles using our circle stencils. I'm going to start with the 1-inch stencil and mask off one of the circles using this masking magic. This masking material comes in 5x7 sheets, which I have trimmed down to fit around the circle. This is repositionable like the Post-it tape I often use, but it holds up much better to being cleaned in between the colors. I'm going to start with salvaged patina and peacock feathers as my ink colors. I'm going to apply a little bit of the lighter ink to my brush, tap off the excess, and then I'm going to apply the ink to the circle. To create the look of a bubble, you want to apply more ink to the outer edges and leave the centers almost white. After adding the lighter color, I'm going to come in with the darker blue and blend a little bit of it on the lower left edge of the circle. Now we can pick up our stencil and see the first bubble. I'm going to move this over to another part of the cardstock and create another. Again, I'm starting with the lighter blue and very little ink on my blending brush. I'm adding ink to the outer edges and leaving the center very light. After I finished with the lighter blue, I'm going to add the darker blue to the lower left to create a shadow. Now I'm going to go off camera and add a few more blue bubbles, then I'll show you how to create the pale pink ones. To create these peachy pink bubbles, I'm going to use tattered rose and spun sugar. I have wiped off my stencil and left the masking material in place. As I add the bubbles this time, I'm going to overlap a few of the other bubbles that are already there. In its description, Distress Oxide states that it's an opaque ink, but when you layer colors together, you can see another color underneath, which makes these bubbles look a bit translucent. You can continue this process of adding circles or bubbles onto your background using a variety of colors. I have chosen 2 like colors for each bubble, but you could easily mix and match colors to create some really cool holographic looking bubbles. I'm going to finish these off camera, then I'll bring in a smaller stencil to create some little bubbles. This time I'm using the 3/4 inch stencil. I'm using the same masking material as before, and it has really held up to all the cleaning. For these bubbles, I'm going to use antique linen and scattered straw. I'm going to repeat the same process as before, adding the lighter color around the edges, leaving the center almost white, then creating a shadow in the lower left. Make sure that your shadow is always in the same position. It's just like when the light is hitting an object, that light is always coming from the same direction. When you add the shadow in the lower left, that means that the light is always coming from the upper right. So off camera, I went ahead and finished the remaining 3/4 inch bubbles. Now I'm going to create some little 1/2 inch circles in my background. I've brought back the salvaged patina and peacock feathers to create some smaller bubbles. The smaller bubbles are a little trickier to add ink to. You don't want to fill that center, but with larger blending tools, it can be difficult. I'm holding my small little blending brush at an angle and swiping inwards towards the center. There are even smaller blending tools available for instances like this, but I've not purchased those yet. After adding a few blue bubbles, I'm going to wipe off my stencil and switch colors. You want to make sure that you're wiping down the front and back of the stencil and wiping off the masking material each time. I'm just using a dry cloth between colors so that they don't get mixed together. I have sped up and skipped a few portions of this part of the process. If you need to pause the video to finish making your bubbles, feel free to do that. Now, this is already starting to look like bubbles floating in the air. I'm going to go ahead and finish some 1/2 inch bubbles, and then we'll bring in the last stencil to create some tiny little bubbles. At this point, my masking material is almost ready to fall apart, but it's going to hold up for this last part. On the smaller bubbles, I'm repeating the same process as before. These smaller bubbles are so tiny that you just need to barely dab your brush on them and you've added the color. If these little ones are too difficult for you, you can go ahead and skip them. As I've added bubbles, I have made sure to create odd numbers of each color, create visual triangles of shapes and colors, and I'm not filling in every little space. You need that white space between those bubbles, and you don't want that background to be too overwhelming. Now, if you want to give these circles a bubble look, you can use a white gel pen to add some light reflections. Since our shadows are in the lower left, our light needs to be in the upper right. These are just curved rectangles and dots, and they make those bubbles really come to life. Isn't this background so cool? I told you that it would take a little bit more time, but it is so worth it. All right, let's go ahead and bring in the supplies for this card and put it together. This Slimline is going to have a beautiful blue backing to match those blue bubbles. I have trimmed down the bubble background, added a little speckled egg blue ink on the edges, which you can barely see, and backed it in black to help it really stand out. This card is going to go together really quick. With such a beautiful background, I don't need to add much to this card. I've created another black thanks sentiment with a heat embossed phrase that says, "For being a friend while keeping a straight face." Now, this stamp set says, "At being a friend," so I did mask off the "at" and added the word "for" from another stamp. Behind the word thanks, I'm going to add a cute pink gingham heart and cover up that little tag hole with a black and white sequin. I'm going to add 2 little pink dots off to the right, and our second card is finished. This has to be one of my favorite backgrounds, and it was created using just simple circle stencils. All right, let's make our third and final card with layered stencils. I'm going to start by creating a background just like I did for the first card. This time I'm going to use speckled egg blue with a large blending brush to create 1-inch circles. I don't want to add too much color because we're going to be layering some other colors over it. Since we've already done this technique, I'm going to go ahead and skip on to the next step. If you need to pause the video and finish your background, feel free to do that. Now that my background is complete, I'm going to add my layered stencil image. I will be layering the 1/4 inch circle behind the 1-inch stencil. Let me show you what the pattern is going to look like. You can hold all of your stencils up and decide which of the looks you prefer. I like the smaller size because it's going to give me more pattern in my circles. I'm going to secure my 2 stencils in place by taping the 2 stencils together with Post-it tape. I'm just going to line them up corner to corner and secure them together. Make sure that none of your tape covers any of the pattern when you're securing them. Now, I could just try to rely on the magnets to hold everything in place, but every time I layer stencils, it never fails. One always seems to shift, so securing them with tape is my solution. I've gone ahead and placed the stencil over the cardstock, lining up all of those 1-inch circles. I'm securing my layered stencils in place using the magnets, and then I'm going to start adding a rainbow of ink. I'm going to start with spun sugar. I have tapped off the excess ink in the lid so that I don't get any blobs of ink under the stencil. Then I'm going to lightly brush my blending brush down the first column of circles. You can see that it is blending a bit with the blue, but if I go back and add another layer of ink, the pink is going to stand out more. It's best if you add layers of ink instead of trying to add a lot of ink in the first go-round. I've brought over that spun sugar into the second column so that I can blend it with the next color. Now I'm going to add some tattered rose, which is kind of a peachy color, and blend it with the pink. I'm also going to add this color into the next set of circles to create my orangey color in my Roy G. Biv rainbow. The next color is antique linen. Again, I'm blending it into the previous color, then creating a column of color in the next line of circles. Now I'm going to shift my stencil. I want to make sure that I wipe down the stencil on the front and the back before I secure it in place. I don't want any ink from the previous colors getting into the new colors. The next color I'm going to use is Scattered Straw. I'm blending with the previous color and adding it to the next 2 columns of circles. In a rainbow, green is the next color after yellow. But I've chosen to use the same set of ink colors on all 3 cards, and none of those were green. Remember in elementary school when you mix primary colors? Well, that's what we're going to do to create the green in our rainbow. I'm going to bring in some salvaged patina and layer it right over the scattered straw. These inks blend so beautifully and are going to create the green hue that I need. I'm going to go ahead and blend that blue into the next line of circles to create my column of blue, and then I'm going to add some bright blue peacock feathers ink at the end. Now, if you wanted a true rainbow, you could add or make violet, but I chose to just end with blue on this card. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the pattern we created with the layered stencils. How cool is that? Someone told me that it looked like an animal print, but I thought it looked like something I would see under a microscope. I'm such a nerd. All right, I'm going to bring in the elements needed for this card and show you how it comes together. After trimming this down, I added a little speckled egg blue around the edges and some faux stitching across the top. I like the texture that adds to the card. I'm layering it onto some black cardstock, which was cut a little smaller than the card base so that I could have a white frame around the edge. I have cut another thanks sentiment with a heat embossed phrase that says, "For all the times you wished I would shut up, but kept listening." I've gone ahead and layered this down onto the card using some foam tape. To the right of the word thanks, I'm going to add a magnolia flower. I've cut this from white cardstock and added a little spun sugar ink in the center. Now there are 2 center petals that go with this flower. I'm going to adhere them in place with some liquid adhesive. If you want more dimension, you can curl the petals and use foam tape between the layers. In the center of the flower, I have 2 black cardstock pieces that I'm going to layer right on top of each other. In the photo for this flower, it shows that you should use only 1, but I like the way it looks with 2. Now I'm just going to add 3 little bitty gems in the center. The last embellishments are some pink dots, and the final card is complete. Let's take a look at all 3 cards we created today using circle stencils. Here are the 3 Slimline cards we created today using circle stencils. Each of these techniques took a few steps to complete, but the results are amazing. I think the bubble background might be my favorite, but I'm also partial to that floral design. Which of these techniques are you going to try? Here are a few close-up photos so that you can see each of these cards in a little bit more detail. Each one used the same colors, stencils, and thank you sentiment, but they all look so different and unique. The sentiments are whimsical and fun, but you can easily change any of these designs to match the occasion. I hope that you enjoyed learning some new ways to use your circle stencils. In the details below, I have posted a link to my blog where there are photos you can save and pin and a list of supplies I used today. If you enjoyed today's tutorial, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button and subscribe. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.